Thank you very much, everyone, for the invitation. Well, you didn't invite me, but Annette did, so thanks to Annette for inviting me and for people making me feel welcome so far, and for everyone who came to the workshop last night. I would just like to put a disclaimer up front, as opposed to someone who is institutionalised in academia. My PhD is neither submitted nor accepted, so I'm not actually a doctor, but thank you. I'll get a feeling for what it might be like, Annette. I've appreciated that. I always used to say to people I'm not a researcher, but then in actual fact I've been evaluating and researching for so long that I finally decided to do the PhD, and I probably should have done it 15 years ago because it would have been a lot less painful than trying to be a full-time director and doing a full-time PhD. But I digress. So today I'm going to talk to you about building community understanding of suicide and suicide prevention, but focusing on I guess two areas of work that I've been leading in Australia, which is around work with both media but also around community conversations. And hopefully it'll kind of tie together with a few different presentations today, but obviously I'm going to take you on a bit of a snapshot and whirlwind tour of that. I actually did go back down memory lane for a while because I do have a degree in psychology, and I don't think I've ever filled out as many surveys as I ever have in my life in year 1 and year 2 of my psychology degree, so I was thinking, yeah, I probably filled out one of those. Very briefly, the Hunter Institute of Mental Health is based in Newcastle, New South Wales, so we're about 160 kilometres north of Sydney. We have a big harbour as well as a beach, so if you haven't, well actually we've got lots and lots of beaches, so if you haven't been there before, please pop in and visit us. But the Hunter Institute of Mental Health started as a local organisation, and we now work nationally in the area of promoting mental health and wellbeing, the prevention of mental illness and the prevention of suicide. And I guess our particular area of knowledge or expertise, or what we've become known for, is the translation of research into practice. And I always say I understand the importance of research because I kind of feel like we're working blind in suicide prevention if we don't have some indicators. And there are a range of different ways that we can use other forms of knowledge as well, but I do kind of hold true. I listened to some of the research before, I know, even going into schools, and how difficult they find issues around eating disorders, self-harm, suicide, and trying to figure out what the connection is between all of those things that they're seeing every single day. Anyway, I digress. So the Hunter Institute of Mental Health does a range of work. We've done some work in the undergraduate development of school teachers, from childcare workers through to secondary school teachers. We've done work developing programs for carers, particularly people who live and support someone with depression. We're developing a new program with the Children's Hospital for children with a chronic illness in their family, so a family resilience program, and hoping to do some longitudinal research around that. We've done a whole range of programs building the capacity of health and non-health workforces, and as part of that we've also been running some specific suicide prevention programs in Australia, and one of the bigger ones we've worked on is the Mindframe National Media Initiative, an initiative I led for 10 years. So I took it from birth to handing it over as a precocious 10-year-old, and I've handed it off to a journalist, so think about taking a deep breath and hanging on tight. And also a brand new resource which is on its way around talking about community discussion of suicide. And can I just say, the New South Wales Minister for Mental Health is about to announce the URL for Conversations Matter at World Suicide Prevention Day events in Sydney, and you're going to get it about 10 minutes in advance. So very briefly, for those who were there last night, Mindframe is a national initiative in Australia around media reporting and portrayal of suicide. We've actually been working on aspects of that national program even before it was called Mindframe. So we started working with a whole range of professions that might have a role in youth suicide prevention back in the late 1990s. And one of the professions that we were working with in the undergraduate area was the training of journalism students. And our success, I guess, of somehow getting journalism programs in Australia to understand the issue and to get it into their curriculum, even the basic paper-based resources we had at that stage, probably filled the Australian government with at least some sense they could trust us with trying to go out and talk to journalists. And so we've been managing that program. You know, it's kind of become a program in sort of around about 2002. And I'm just giving you a snapshot of these because some of I guess the tips or things I'm going to talk about come from both of these areas of work. So Mindframe works not just with media, but also so we work with the news media, film and television, everything in between. So I'm never quite sure what we call talk radio or breakfast TV these days. I think they're an attempt at being entertainment or news. We work with journalism and public relations programs across Australia. So every university that offers journalism has something in their program around reporting of suicide and mental illness. Every code of practice in Australia for journalists has something in it around the reporting of suicide, and they all say pretty much the same thing. Every 2 to 3 years we get to have another go at enhancing them. We work with the broad mental health and suicide prevention sector, police and courts. And we kind of do that in 4 key ways. So developing evidence-based resources, and so their translation of the evidence into practical resources. Those are also being updated at the moment. Professional development and sector engagement. And as I was telling the group last night, professional development looks different for all those sectors. So with journalists, you don't do training, for the journalists in the room, hi. You do briefing sessions and you get 1 to 2 hours. If you run sessions for screenwriters, you get a full day and you get a hug at the end of it. So again, you can call them different things, you get different amounts of time. You have to learn to hug with some of them. We also work in changing policies and procedures across, you know, all of those different sectors that we're working with. So currently trying to get it into media policies and training policies for police across Australia as an example, as well as media policies, and trying to show some national leadership. And so the people that actually do the media work and have partnerships with the media are actually the mental health and suicide prevention sector and, you know, and individuals. And what we do is provide the support behind that. Here's your snapshot, brand new resource website URL being announced today. It's conversationsmatter.com.au, but .com will work as well. And the New South Wales government, because we like to have states in Australia, just because try and make it a bit more complicated for people who want to work nationally. So our state where we live has, I guess, taken this in the last couple of years in Australia, and probably a bit longer than that, and from what I would understand here in New Zealand as well, we've had this groundswell, which is, should we talk more about suicide? It's been so long that people found it difficult to find the words, and it was spoken about in hushed tones, and sometimes not even behind closed doors. And so as we've kind of got to know more and we're doing more work in the area, their 2 communities as well have found their voice. And so wanting to know, how do we talk about suicide? And so how do we talk about it in schools, in workplaces, in families, in communities, online, okay? So just an easy task. And so, you know, for us it was a good piece of work to do, because people often got the guidelines or the recommendations around media and what that meant for conversations quite mixed up. In the same way too that we often look at evidence in clinical settings and think that that automatically applies to community settings, or evidence from one-on-one type conversations actually applies to group conversations, and it kind of is a bit more complex and complicated than that. So essentially these new resources will have some community stream of resources, so some basic information for communities about having certain types of conversations. So for example, there'll be one on there, I know someone who's been bereaved by suicide, what do I say, what do I do? So trying to get people some basic tips. Now these aren't going to be rocket science and not going to be that different to what resources already exist. Some of the differences are that what communities and also what the sector have been saying to us is not another bloody fact sheet. Can I just say I reviewed all of the fact sheets in Australia that might sort of say something around this issue. We've got about over 120 last year when we're looking at them. Good news is they all pretty much say the same thing, same types of things. Bad news is none of them actually reference where the first person got the first idea from, so there's no way of going back and seeing whether it still makes any kind of sense or whether it's actually still accurate. So for anyone who writes fact sheets, and I'm one of them, I know You know, you don't want to be doing APA referencing, you know, taking up half your fact sheet with the references. But somewhere there should be documentation of how the resource was developed. So one of the processes that we're going through with Conversations Matter is actually documenting the process by which we got to the recommendations, so that when they need to be updated, or when people are looking at them, say internationally, they can see what comparisons can be made, or how they might be able to test whether their local communities, whether this kind of works for them as well. And I'll talk to you a little about the process in a moment. And I'll keep going because I need to get on to the crux of it. But the other thing is too, I think the main part of those resources for me are the resources for, I'm calling them professional resources, but they're really for our broad sector, because I think we all need to get on the same page, because we are the people that support communities and enhance the ways in which they talk. And so the recommendation shouldn't come from a team of very attractive people living in Newcastle, but they should come through the people who are the, sorry, people don't get my jokes, people who are the gatekeepers, or the people who are the trusted and valued source of advice for local communities. And so how can you take the resources and apply them to your work? How can you not worry about the pretty Conversations Matter logos, but take the principles and integrate them into your training so that people are getting some sense of consistency? Okay, so talking about suicide, what's all the fuss about? I wrote, if anyone follows me on Twitter, I somehow yesterday morning attempted to send, with technological failure from New Zealand, an opinion piece to my local newspaper, who do some great partnership work. And, you know, saying that people often say to me, is talking about suicide that different? And the answer is yes and no. And I think that's the thing that makes it complex, because in some respects, no, it's not different. You need to connect with, if you're talking about individuals having one-on-one conversations, then it's about having a meaningful connection. You don't need the right words to say if you're able to sit with someone and able to connect with them in a real way. So in some senses, no, it's not different. But it is in many other ways, because the bigger the group gets, I think there are some more things that we need to think about. And the bigger the group then gets into media, which is wide scale, things start changing again. And so, again, my hope is through the resources we can start to unpick some of that complexity in a way that doesn't make it more difficult for people to understand, but easier for us to understand a bit and be able to apply it to the work that we're doing. So I'm going to start with some assumptions up front, because sometimes I can be a bit of a naysayer when I say that suicide is a bit different. But I want to say this. Suicide's a preventable cause of death which is important to communities. It's important to individuals, it's important to families, it's important to everybody. So saying nothing about how to prevent it, or saying nothing about the issue of suicide, makes no sense. Okay? It makes no sense to say nothing. If you're worried that someone might be at risk of suicide or thinking about suicide, again, saying nothing to them makes no sense. Okay, we don't have any more information than what we had from looking from the outside. And if you know someone who's experienced a loss, who's lost someone to suicide, then saying nothing to them also makes no sense, because they feel the isolation even more profoundly than they already do. And so if you're saying up front that saying nothing makes no sense, then the question is then, what do we say, how do we say it, where should we say it, who should say it, and then what's the role of media? Because I think sometimes, you know, and we kind of take, I think we all understand those assumptions. Saying nothing doesn't make any sense. But without some kind of consistency, you know, some shared understanding of that, then our own values pretty much fill in what should be said, who should say it, and what and how and where. And so we have lots of varying opinions about, and I'll say that they're opinions, about how we talk about suicide. And I'm probably just going to provide you with another opinion informed by a range of different experiences. So one of the things I also say, if we're thinking about the issue of suicide, then there's a range of lenses we need to think about in that discussion area, and this has kind of led our thinking around Conversations Matter, and I keep saying that word because I'm getting used to the new name. It used to be called New South Wales Community Guidelines for Discussing Suicide, and they wanted to know why we needed a new name. I thought that would engage communities. So what's the purpose of the discussion is the first thing, because if we're going to talk about the prevention of suicide or broadly about the issue of suicide, it's probably going to be quite different to what we might say to somebody who is thinking about suicide or trying to talk to someone we're worried about, and it might be quite different to what we say following a suicide death, either in individual conversations or in more broad community conversations. So initially, what's the focus? Okay, what is the actual conversation about? How is the conversation going to happen? Because we know from the limited evidence that we have that it's quite different if it's a one-on-one conversation versus a small group conversation versus wide-scale or media type conversation. So what's the format of the discussion? Where's it happening? We actually know there is some different evidence, but also some different things to factor in if you're having the conversation in schools, in workplaces, in families, in communities, or online, okay? And even different types of formats online for that matter. And then who's the target group? So does something about the individuals or the group of individuals actually make a difference to how we think about this? So is their sexual orientation important? Is their age important? Is their gender important? Is their cultural background and their cultural identity important? And so again, if you kind of stretch it apart like that, so my very first meeting of the steering committee in New South Wales, I said, this is how I'm thinking about this. And we took this little thing which was, could you whip us up some guidelines for talking about suicide? And I said, this is how I'm thinking about it. And went, focus of discussion, format, where it's happening and who it's with. And they went, ooh. And I said, well, exactly. I mean, you need to actually understand the complexity of the issue before you can try and pull it back down and make some, I guess, generalised or more concrete suggestions to people. You need to at least understand the complexity before you can try, to work with it. It's always better to know more. As I was sort of mentioning last night, I think the kind of conversations can be had differently depending on, I guess, the where people are at in terms of their connection to the issue of suicide. And so particularly in wide-scale communication, I'd often say to our journalists, it doesn't matter if you're trying to write a story or produce a story that is trying to get to group one, which is the not affected, not yet interested. So in terms of trying to motivate those of us who mightn't yet have come across the issue of suicide and trying to get people to be engaged and interested. At the same time, when you send out wide-scale communication, there'll be people who've got some level of connection or interest. You'll also have people who are currently vulnerable and thinking about suicide, and you'll have people who've been impacted or bereaved by suicide. And all of those people might read slightly different things into what you've said based on their connection to the issue. And that's forgetting all of the rest of the diversity in communities. And so I think we need to understand that, and particularly if we're talking about, I know talking to a big room of people here, I can assume that you're all at least in group, I was going, the thing's going to be here, it's over there. You're either going to be in group 1 or group 2, but I also know that you're going to be probably potentially in group 3 and group 4 as well. And so I think you wouldn't be at a suicide prevention conference if you weren't at least had some level of interest in the topic. So I wanted to, keeping an eye on time, I just wanted to talk, I wanted to kind of take those two experiences and then just give you what I think is just a snapshot of what I think are some myths and facts to understand about communication about suicide. And they're kind of around general and also media related. And I'll say these are going to be like a tweet rather than a dissertation because we're going to whip through them quite fast. And so I often say, as I was saying before and alluding to, talking about suicide's not like talking about soap. It's not like talking about, most other issues that we talk about. Sorry, I shouldn't have used the soap analogy. It was just that often we talk to journalists and say it's not like you're reporting on soap. You're reporting on something that's actually got some human interest, and it's not about how to sell soap. So suicide is different. That's my belief, that talking about suicide's different. And I also say, as a community, we need to ensure that we're not too afraid to talk about suicide, but we also need to respect and understand the risks in certain settings and certain groups. And I think that some of our blanket discussions sometimes, we've got some quite high-profile people in Australia, some other communities, who just sort of more blanketly say, we just need to talk more about suicide in every context. And I think, well, what does that actually mean? What is it that you want more of? And I think we need to be quite specific about what it is. And we do also need to respect some of the risks, okay? It doesn't mean that, as I said before, saying nothing is not an option, but we do actually need to understand a little bit about it. So the risks associated with the discussion of suicide seems to be related to what the focus of the information is on. So, particularly if we're looking at media studies, if we're talking about reporting of individual deaths, that has a stronger association with increases in suicidal behaviour than perhaps more broader kind of discussion of the issue of suicide, where we know a lot less. But what is the focus of the discussion? Okay, so that seems to have some input into whether the risk is increased or decreased or nothing. The status of the individual receiving the information seems to be possibly the most important in terms of potential risk for information or discussion about suicide. So is the person, as I said before, uninterested in the topic? So again, just deciding today, walk into a classroom or a workplace without warning and tell them we're going to talk in detail about suicide, just kind of, for those of us who talk about it a lot, I can kind of understand that. When people walk into my house and see Thomas Joyner's book on my coffee table, Why People Die by Suicide, I can see a reaction in them. You've got to understand that for some people this is going to be a bit more uncomfortable to start with. The format they receive the information in, and so obviously there is different evidence for face-to-face and one-on-one conversations as there is for conversations that then happen in groups or in wide-scale ways, and also the place in which they receive the information. And I think we need to understand that our recommendations for how clinical conversations can or should occur, or how conversations can occur within families, might be very different to how conversations happen within schools and within workplaces. I say it's a myth that reducing stigma associated with suicide is straightforward and is the same as the stigma associated with mental illness. And again, I'll try and give you a very short synopsis of why I think that. So many agree that there's a stigma associated with suicide. I often then ask people, what is the stigma that you're talking about? Is it the stigma of being impacted by suicide, or feeling suicidal, have experienced suicide? And so again, we kind of lump all the different types of stigma in together. But I think the approach to reducing stigma around suicide must be different. And as I said before, I work in both mental health and in suicide prevention. And in mental health, I kind of say it's a bit easier. And you've got great stigma campaigns here in New Zealand. I'm a bit envious across the ditch. We still talk about signs and symptoms in Australia, thinking that will reduce stigma. But in one respect, we know that if we think about what creates stigma, it's ignorance and it's fear. Okay, and so those two things, regardless of what the stigma is about. And so usually our approach to reducing stigma is to attack both the ignorance and the fear, okay? But in suicide, in fact, one of those two is protective. So the fear of death, the fear of dying, and the fear of physical pain are actually protective. And so we need to be mindful of our attempts to reduce stigma don't inadvertently make suicide seem something that should be feared less, okay? So if you haven't read Thomas Joyner's work, then I would encourage you to do so, because I think his theories and models can help explain this. And I also think, my theorising around how, why people who are self-harming and not for suicidal intent, I believe that, having sat clinically with people who self-harm, they're not doing it for suicidal intent, but they're also getting used to the physical pain. They're also getting used to the breaking down that fear associated with physical pain. I can tell you I'm a bit wussy, I don't like physical pain at all. And so they're breaking down that. So as soon as the intent changes, we need to be more worried. Okay. And so again, it just makes it tricky, and it's what makes the kind of more public messaging around suicide, trying to address and attack the stigma, a little bit more tricky. And I think as people working in the sector, we do need to understand that it is a bit tricky and it is a bit different. There is definitely confusion about what we mean by talking about suicide. I'll go through this briefly. You know, are we talking about one-on-one conversations, group presentations, media reporting of deaths, media reporting of more broader issues of suicide, just to give you a few of those. And if we're going to say we want to talk more about suicide, could we please get specific about what it is that we're asking for? Because communities get very confused. Okay? Media gets confused, we all get confused. And there are some things that we know and that we don't know in terms of talking about suicide, and my apologies for those last night, have already seen this slide. So we do know, generally speaking, that talking to someone one-on-one directly about suicide won't increase their suicide risk. However, I will also say that most of that research that underpins that, it's something we've been saying for a very long time. So when I went back and I feel like we've just been through an election, I'm still traumatised. But, you know, we had a fact checker in Australia, and I feel like sometimes we need to be a bit of a fact checker for our own resources. This statement, talking to someone about their suicide risk won't increase their risk, or similar versions of that, is in just about every resource we put out in suicide prevention. There's actually no empirical evidence in the community settings to actually support that. What there is some expert opinion that we think that it probably won't. We know from clinical settings it's important to ask people, and it doesn't necessarily increase their risk. And we know from screening and people participating in research, it doesn't necessarily increase their risk. So we can probably extrapolate that, but I think we need to we kind of talk about it as if it's an exact and an actual fact. We do also know that media reporting of suicide deaths have been and are associated with increased risk for those who are vulnerable to suicide. What we don't know, however, and I think we need to be humble about what we don't know, is whether group presentations about suicide will increase or decrease risk. And so, for example, if you look at the research evidence from schools, it's quite conflicting, which is why we can have very strong opinions in communities about what we need to do in schools. But also it's a very difficult thing when you've actually got conflicting evidence that certain ways of doing it might actually increase the risk of some people. And so how then do you do that? And we also don't know whether more general media reporting about suicide, or even campaigns for that matter, will increase or decrease risk. We just don't know. I think they're difficult. I'm going to go through quickly. I would also say this, and I can say this humbly having looked at the evidence, and it does fill me with a little bit of dread that I'm about to send a new resource for communities live, and I know that the research evidence underpinning it is not good, but I also know that doing nothing while we're waiting for some of that to catch up, you know, if you leave a void, it will get filled by something, and so we need to find ways of working with what we have. But I would say that it's actually a myth that we have evidence to support community discussion of suicide, and I'm talking about that in a, you know, in a research sense, that we've actually got some evidence to support best practice ways. So I'm not going to go into this in detail, but want to say that there's very little research evidence to either support or refute a number of those common assertions that we often all say about the discussion of suicide. And I think, interestingly, when we go and have a look at where there is some evidence, things like emotional discomfort and sense of self-efficacy have actually been more identified as overcoming obstacles to having conversations, and will actually impact the outcome of conversations more than anything else. So I kind of I could just imagine how I'd go, going, look, I need some more funding for our early years programs to build emotional kind of strength and self-efficacy in young people, because that will actually help them have conversations about suicide when they're older. I'm pretty sure it'd be difficult, but the kind of is the sorts of things that the research supports, that those kind of other foundational pieces of work, those other things around developing a good sense of self, is actually the thing that's going to be helpful for having conversations. If anyone's interested, I'll talk to you about the process we've gone through for Conversations Matter later, because again, it's tricky when you're trying to work with literally no evidence, but I'm not going to go into it now because I've only got a few minutes to finish up. Very briefly, because I covered this last night, it's a myth that with the evidence around media reporting is weak. Actually, the evidence is very strong in particular areas, and the evidence is around media reporting of suicide deaths. Okay, and so we have over 100 studies that have looked at media reporting of suicide. 87% of them have found a link between media reporting of suicide and increased rates of suicidal behaviour following that reporting. Okay, it's just something that we need to understand and be able to utilise in our work with media around how do we actually, talk about this issue in a broader sense. We need to understand the particular elements that create an increased risk. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but hit me up at lunch if you want to know more. And this I also want to say, again, we need to be humble about things we don't know, because we actually don't know about the possible benefits of media. That people often say is the non-reporting actually worse than the potential risk of certain reporting. And I think again we just actually don't know. There's limited evidence to actually support campaigns, to support broader discussion of the issue. A recent study by Thomas Niederkrofenthaler, I've been practicing his name so I can say it now, actually shows that the one thing, as I was saying last night, that he actually found that was associated with decreases in suicidal behaviour following the media reporting were people talking about how they mastered crisis. So people talking about their experience of overcoming times in their life that were difficult and times in their life when they thought about suicide. Okay, and so again, giving people a different model to look towards, someone who's actually giving them a different sense of what worked rather than trying to always figure out what didn't work. Interestingly though, he also found that reports about suicide attempts and experts talking about suicide were all associated with increases in suicidal behaviour. We're useless. Sorry, that's the royal we as in me. I would also say too, I'm going to keep going, sorry. I'll go down to the final points. I'm going to finish on this last point because my time's up. I'll make sure my slides are available so you can go through the others. The other thing is, it is a fact that we actually don't know whether social media is the same or different to the impacts of media reporting or other types of conversations. I mean, it's a reality that research is not keeping up with the technology. My age is not keeping up with the technology necessarily, but you will find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, all of those. I'm in the hood. But I guess the thing I'd say about social media is that it kind of cuts across all those different types of conversations. So we have one-on-one conversations online, but some of those are private, so almost like text messages, so private messaging online. But we can have one-on-one conversations with onlookers. So you kind of post something on someone's Facebook page, but everyone who's their friend can see it. So is that one-on-one or is that group? We've got large group communication driven out. We've got lots of kind of social media campaigns and things like that going out. One of the issues, I think they've got potential benefits, but one of the issues is they're often not driven by the sector, which is probably good in one respect, because I think, we're a bit boring sometimes and we're not really good at engaging. But I think one of the issues is, though, then the messages are not being market tested, we're not evaluating the effectiveness, and we actually just don't know what the impact of them are. And I think we do need to work together to find out ways of managing some of the risks. So what are the risks with memorial pages? What are the risks of people posting online their suicidal intent, and how do we manage that? But I also want us to think about the possibilities, because the technology is here to stay. The world in which we live has forever changed people. And so if you think about it, Facebook is the second biggest country in terms of population, and you don't have to go through different governments to use it. You don't even have to go through your state government. Australia have to go through 7 different state governments to do something national. And so if you think about the opportunities that scale of communication could provide us, if we were able to invest and understand with how do we then monitor, and how can we best use that communication channel, and how can we empower people to use it with each other in ways that are protective, so connection and connecting with each other, and to not use it or to manage the ways in which it could be used for creating risk or exacerbating risk. And so with that, I will finish, and I will leave you with this final statement, which is, I will just say for those of us, and I should have said up front, I'm a researcher, I'm a psychologist, I'm also someone who's been personally bereaved by suicide. But I say we need to be confident to implement the things that we know, and we need to be humble about what we don't know. And could we stop funding and stop investing in things that we know don't work? I can say that in someone else's country. Thank you.